Welcome to another episode of Mrs. Skeptic Radio. We are continuing our conversation with Tom Saunders. Last time we were discussing all the stuff going down with the Epstein files and how disappointed we are with the religious community and the lack of a response or accountability to the all kinds of different leaders who have been involved with this. So now we're going to delve deep into what is the evangelical movement about? I remember being surprised when I came from Mexico that there was a large Catholic presence in the US. And then when I started coming across different evangelical groups, uh, I didn't realize how political and how like close-minded they were. It's almost like an Americana kind of I don't know if it's the Reagan administration or who made American Christianity so hokey. And that's pretty much what we're going to go into is like when someone grows up with that mindset, what are the major components they're concerned about? And I can tell you from my experience, it would be the end of the world and somehow connected to the state of Israel, some type of morality police within their circles. That was how it was back in the 90s. Now it's become morality police with culture war. And then the sense of evangelism that um, before I thought it was kind of interesting that people were going out telling people about God, trying to get people connected to God. And now it's become like a mockery. I was talking to a fellow chaplain, and they were saying that if you go to any event and you try to tell people about God, that you automatically are going to alienate people and offend them because there have been so many crazy preachers with megaphones. Um, so let's start from the beginning. What were the messaging and culture that you grew up around as you were developing in that worldview?
It's really interesting that it was quite different. And I'd like to start out by saying, even though some of the theology and some of the rigidness of evangelical culture that you see now was there then, it was really apolitical in the early 60s and in the mid to late 60s. Um, my parents were very kind and loving people. They made their mistakes like everybody else, but they were completely dedicated to this. I would call it sort of on the edge of evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And even though they were close to the fundamentalist side, politics didn't enter into their faith. My mom was a Democrat. My dad was a Republican. They never, ever argued about politics. I remember in 1976, my father voted for Ford, my mother voted for Carter, and there was no discussion about it. So the political part wasn't that strong, at least in my upbringing. I was born in 1962, and I think I was in church before I was 3 days old. My family was very, very devout, very religious. Um, I start to remember going to church when we moved to New Jersey in 1965. And it was a fundamentalist church. But again, I say fundamentalist, it was fundamentalist theologically. The pastors were very kind and reasonable men. I don't recall any emotional abuse, or I don't recall any hatred in that whole church. The Sunday school teachers were kind and loving. There was the dispensational theology and the ideas about heaven and hell, which could scare a kid. And I will say, in that church, I had a religious experience um, that was given the terms of accepting Christ as Savior. And I had a unique experience in that I had a 3-day mystical journey at 7 years old. And I can't describe it completely. When I've described it to other people, uh, they thought I had taken LSD or something. But it was the most beautiful experience of my life. Um, but I never had that again. and that'll come into play a little later. But that church was very kind, and we moved. And my dad worked for a defense contractor that transferred him to Western Ohio, and we joined a church of the same denomination in Western Ohio. And for the most part, that church was full of kind people. The ministers were kind, they were friendly, um, they weren't abusive. There were expectations, pretty much, of that you would dress a certain way, that you would avoid alcohol, drugs, you would avoid secular music. There was some flexibility in secular music and films. My parents took a hard line. I was not allowed to listen to secular music, nor was I allowed to go to movies, and I was allowed very little television. So I kind of had a cultural blank spot from about, I'll say, 1968 until maybe 1978, and that I could watch the news. I knew what was going on in the world with Watergate and the civil rights movement and the violence in the early 70s, the bombing of the Pentagon. White House was bombed at that time as well. Um, and I think it was Blair House across the road uh, from the White House that was bombed at that time. That might have been earlier. But, I knew what was going on in the world. My parents let me watch the news, and I was allowed to watch, half hours worth of cartoons and stuff. But that was out of their religious views. Again, my mom and dad weren't perfect, but they meant well and they did well. They were good parents. However, they perhaps could have done more to let me think for myself. And I will say my father did. If I stated something a little on the extreme side, he would give a little bit of correction. One example I remember pretty clearly was, because of our dispensationalist theology, there was a belief that the state of Israel could do no wrong. And I remain a supporter of the Jewish state. Um, but I remember mentioning something that the Israeli government or the IDF had done, and how that didn't sound right, but they were God's people and they couldn't do wrong. And I remember my father saying, "Hey, Israelis are just like everybody else. There's good people, there's bad people. Governments are good, governments are bad. Just because they're Israelis, don't accept everything they do." But he was a staunch supporter of the state of Israel till he died. In fact, I remember his radiation oncologist was an Orthodox Jewish man, and those two got along. My dad is an engineer, this radiation oncologist. They actually became friends while he was getting cancer treatment. It was fun to watch. But during that time, once we moved to Ohio, the church we went to was rather small, and I had three close friends. One that was not really religious, but he had a good critical mind for a young person. One that was in the Reformed Jewish community, but not very active, and one that was in what I would call hyper fundamentalism. He was in the independent fundamentalist Baptist group. And because our church had no youth group, my parents would let me go with him to this independent fundamentalist Baptist, IFB they call it. And wow, it was crazy. I mean, crazy fundamentalist. It was still more liberal than current IFB churches for the most part. There was a lot of what I would call emotional abuse and spiritual abuse and maybe psychological abuse. I had no knowledge of any kind of sexual abuse or physical abuse in that church, but um, it was the kind of thing that was so legalistic and fundamentalist that you began laughing at it. Even I went because I was, I had some friends there. I liked some of the girls there. I had friends there. But some of the things they said, even coming from a nearly fundamentalist evangelical background, I would laugh at that stuff because it was just out to lunch crazy.
Hold on, Tom. We're gonna
Yeah.
define some terms. So, according to the internet, Christian fundamentalism focuses on a document from the Presbyterians from 1910, which says that the scripture is inerrant, so there's nothing untrue in the Bible. The virgin birth of Jesus, the substitutionary atonement, Jesus died for human sins, um, bodily resurrection, of Jesus and the authenticity of the miracles and the second coming. Do you see it as a backlash from the more enlightenment-based Christian groups that are started questioning the miracles and started to say that everything was metaphorical or something like that?
Yeah, historically, it wasn't that it was a backlash, it was a statement of faith because at that time, due to there weren't much in the way of theological graduate schools in the United States. So the thinking clergy would go to Germany or England and to study. And some of these ideas of higher criticism, where they no longer believed in the divine authority of the Scripture, came back to the United States. This was in the 1800s. So the fundamentalists at that time, which would be sort of mainstream evangelicals now, or even evangelicals light now, published these statements to differentiate themselves from these higher critical bodies. And some of the graduate schools in the United States, like Harvard Divinity School, Yale Divinity School, Union Theological Seminary, had begun to teach these newer ideas about biblical interpretation. So, in response, some of the authors of that statement started Westminster Theological Seminary with a master's and doctoral program with a more traditional view of Christianity. And I would say the original fundamentals were just traditional Christianity. Whether you believe that or not, they weren't extreme for the time. What fundamentalism became was more of a cultural movement than a theological movement by the time I came around. It had much more to do with how one acts in culture and how one reacts to culture than theological statements like the early fundamentalists. It was sort of funny to read those in seminary and realize that they weren't extreme at all for the time. And for mainstream Christianity in the 80s, when I went to seminary, they weren't extreme then either, but they didn't reflect fundamentalism in the 1980s. It'd become a political and cultural movement more than a theological movement by then.
But when you say that the stuff they were saying was laughable, was it kind of like silly, kind of naive, nerdy stuff, or was it apocalyptic and miraculous in nature?
Both. They weren't Pentecostal in the miraculous sense, and I don't mean to diss Pentecostals or Baptists or anybody, but they were more. If you ever get a chance, there was a guy named Estes Perkel. He was a Mississippi Baptist minister, and he produced 3 movies in the early 70s, and they were hilariously bad. One on communism, one on dispensational end times, and I can't recall what the other one was. But if you would, they're on YouTube. If you would take a chance to watch any movies that were produced by Estes Perkel, you would understand why we would laugh at these things, and they were meant to scare us into becoming believers, and they were just silly. And they were incredibly low budget, incredibly campy, but they took themselves so seriously that it was laughable. And I would say those movies would be a good example of some of the things we were told, especially about eschatology and world politics in one case, that you can see why we laughed at it. Yeah, the other thing would be if you listen to the Beatles, you were going to become demon possessed, or if you listen to the Monkees, you were going to get. I mean, we're talking about the Beatles and the Monkees weren't Christian examples, but I mean it's pretty bland music compared to like speed metal or something like that. So we were told if we grew our hair like Paul McCartney, we were following the devil, stuff like that. It was just laughable, you know.
Okay,
But those early years, I didn't feel any sense of persecution because I was a Christian. I felt a sense of persecution because my culture made me such a nerd, and my parents refused to let me dress in the modern style. And some of the girls in our church had it even worse. I mean, they looked like Little House on the Prairie or Anne of Green Gables going to school, and those weren't necessarily, we didn't, as I grew up, I didn't see those as religious restrictions. They were just assumed cultural restrictions that someone had interpreted from the Bible. So I never felt like anyone was down on me for being a Christian. The other thing was, we were so influenced to proselytize that when I'd go to school, I might talk to a Presbyterian next to me in school and tell him he wasn't good enough because he was a Presbyterian and Presbyterians were liberal, and that doesn't make you the most popular kid in school, when you're just in other people's faith and culture. So there did develop a persecution complex in evangelicalism at the time. But honestly, I don't think it was because of what we believed. I think it was because how we were influenced to act and dress and live in the world a certain way. And when you never go to movies or never listen to the radio and don't watch much TV, you're not up on what everybody else is talking about. My dad was a strict Sabbatarian. Sunday was Sabbath, not Saturday. So after church, we'd come home and we couldn't watch television. We could go outside and do things, but it was a day of rest. And I never saw a Super Bowl till I left home, because even though my dad loved football, Sundays were Sabbath. You couldn't watch TV. And, that was another kind of weird thing. Of course, I snuck down to my friend's house and watched TV and broke the rules wherever I could. But um, those kind of things made us have a persecution complex. And I think some of that has carried through to modern day, where, evangelicals might be laughed at for some silly things they say, but nobody's locking them up or torturing them like people in communist China or something like that. There's no real legitimate persecution going on with evangelicals, but there's this cultural persecution complex. Um, and that was kind of basically my life between, you know, birth and middle school. About halfway, do you have any questions real quick? Because some of the political environment was completely different then. I would say up until 1980, we didn't even think that much about political alignment or involvement.
Well, the stuff that you're telling me, it might be weird for some of our progressive friends that are listening to the show,
Mm-hmm.
but for religious Jews and religious Muslims, it sounds reasonable. It sounds, how are you going to keep your kids away from negative traits in the culture? It's going to be by protecting them from it and by setting yourself apart. Um, on the other hand, there is the sense of missing out that you mentioned, where a kid can feel like they're the weirdo because they're not engaging with the culture. And then in the 90s, they were trying to Christianize the culture. So they would take a movie like The Matrix and try to find Christian symbols in it, or they would make silly T-shirts where they change logos and they make them about the Holy Spirit or Jesus. Um,
Yeah,
I see you
yeah.
rolling your eyes. Uh,
Oh,
but in Christianity throughout history, if you look at the Romans and the Greeks and stuff like that, they appropriated a lot of pagan stuff and even Jewish stuff, and then they Christianized it. So there is some leeway between being culturally combative, being culturally engaged, and being hokey and ridiculous. So I think that, you know, in now as a parent, I'm like, I I'm trying to be careful what my kids are exposed to, because it could be too much at once and you don't even have time to explain it. And then there's some stuff that is just, you know, no good. Like even it might be artistic, but it has some connotations that are inappropriate, or it's just mindless stuff. So it's a lot to process, but to me, as an adult, you can go back in time and listen to Pink Floyd or whatever. Like it's not like you really missed anything other than uh, some experiences.
and I want to say you have a very good point, and I don't criticize my parents for that era of my life, because I think parents have the right to raise their children as they see fit, as long as there's no abuse or harm. So I think you have a very good point, and I don't criticize my parents for that period, or honestly for the next period of my life, it was a lot of people thought I was slightly abused because of it. But I'll tell you a funny story. In the 70s, when a movie would come out, I don't know why people did that. They would print a novel version of the screenplay and sell it in bookstores. And for whatever reason, my school library would get those. And so, like when a movie came out that I wasn't allowed to watch, that everybody was talking about, I would check the novelized screenplay out of my school library, and I had better reading comprehension at 12 than I do at 64. Let me tell you, I could read those books in an hour or two. And so I'd check them out, take them home, read them, bring them back, and then I could act like I went to see the movie. It's kind of funny, but I don't at all criticize my parents or any other parents uh, who choose to raise their kids within their cultural context and their religious context. Not at all. And in fact, I think that's a right that parents have. So um, anyway, going on about halfway through middle school, there was a Christian organization called Campus Life, and it was under an umbrella organization called Youth for Christ, and it was interdenominational. And somehow one of the executive director of that program had gone to our church for a while, and my parents really liked him and considered him a great guy. And I kind of looked at him like an uncle. He was a really good guy. So they let us go to that. Now, that was very much engaged with the culture. Um, we'd meet in somebody's house on a weeknight, and there might be 20 to 30 people who would attend, and we'd move around to different houses. And it was designed to engage young people, uh, both to evangelize them and to strengthen them and their Christian beliefs. Yet, the directors I had were a man and a woman who eventually married each other. Um, Especially the woman of the couple really encouraged critical thinking in a really um, sweet and gentle way. And she challenged me a lot to think about certain things. Like they were talking about eschatology once, and they were giving all the different Christian views of eschatology, and I got angry. And I said, no, there's only one end times theology, and that's dispensationalism. And she very gently and kindly said, well, so and so over there is a Lutheran, and they have a completely different view of the end of the world. And what do you think of that person personally? I said, oh, they're great. And she said, do you think they're a good Christian? I said, yeah. She said, well, then why can't you just agree to disagree on end of times things? She said, because that's not a Christian fundamental that you actually believe in dispensationalism. And that planted a seed with me to start to say, oh, okay, different Christians believe different things. And it made me less combative with people who weren't in my fundamentalist circle. The other thing that group did, they had really, uh, idea expanding activities. Like I went to Toronto twice to these conferences, and going to Toronto in the late 70s was fabulous. Toronto was a beautiful city. It was incredibly safe. And, you're a 16-year-old kid, and they turn you loose at 10 o'clock at night to go walking around Toronto because it was completely safe. It was wonderful. And then we took these week-long bicycle trips in the summers. One year we rode from Boston down to Washington, D.C., and, the people you meet on a trip like that. Another year we rode from Niagara Falls up to Montreal, and the Canadian people couldn't have been kinder to us. They were very welcoming and let us, hang out, let us sleep in their churches. Farmers would let us swim in their ponds. It was just a wonderful time. And then finally, I went on a trip to India with them in 1979. And for, a 17-year-old kid, that really opens up your mind, spending a month in India. And it was all under, the Christian rubric, but it really expanded your thinking about the rest of the world. And I think, maybe for the first time, even though there were a lot of Hispanic and Mexican immigrant kids in my community due to field work, very few African Americans, but it was the first time I actually made friends. I mean, deep friendships with foreign people and saw how uh, intelligent they were. And just because they weren't Americans didn't mean they were, stupid foreigners. And I was just so changed by that trip. And it was about that time that Jerry Falwell formed his moral majority, and that's what's going to affect the next 10 years or so of evangelicalism and the next chapter of my upbringing. I did have. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So this trip to India was a mission trip, correct?
Yeah, and they were honestly said, we're not there to go help the folks in India. We're going there because they'll help us learn. And that was the word. We're not going for them. We're going for us. So don't feel like you're giving them charity. Feel like they're giving you an experience you won't have otherwise, which was a really good way to look at
But you were building churches, helping with the infrastructure, or were you evangelizing?
it. We were building. We had two projects. One was a youth center, and we were only able to build the foundation for it, but that was a nice thing. And then in the slums, it was in Chennai. It was called Madras back in those days. And there was a pastor who had requested help because his parishioners um, were literally living on pads made out of dried cow dung. Now, dried cow dung in 125-degree heat smells real bad for about a month, but then it doesn't smell anymore. These people were sleeping on dried cow dung floors. And when the monsoons would come in, uh, that would wash them away. So he asked if we would come and build concrete pads for their huts. And I spent, a really nice time out in this horrible slum area building concrete pads and interacting through translators, interacting with the locals. It was just beautiful.
Okay, so it was a good deed. It wasn't because I always have problems with mission trips going to Mexico to tell people about Jesus when everybody's Catholic and they'll go build a church, but then they go evangelize at the same time, or they go to like Haiti or something like that where people are either Catholic or another denomination, and they're just annoying and bothering people. And then there's places like India where they'll go to a place that is not Orthodox Christian or Protestant, and they're trying to turn people around. And if you look at it from a Christian perspective, you have to do that because everybody should hear the message of Jesus. But it seems that yours was action oriented and supporting a local community, and that was pretty bold for your parents to allow you to do that as an outreach from your denomination.
Well, they had a lot of faith in this organization I went with because the director had been such a good friend of our family. Now, I will say we weren't prohibited from proselytizing, but that wasn't the purpose of the trip. And because there were so many folks from the local church that accompanied us, we were told, yeah, if you want to talk to people about your faith, that's fine. But these people, they're here, they live here, they know everybody. They're the ones who can talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it far better than you can. So you can just allow them to do it. And a lot of educated folks in India speak English. It's the largest English speaking, or the largest English speaking population in the world is in India. Uh, but these folks spoke English and the local language. And so we were told, if you want to share, that's fine. But these folks are the ones who can really do it. And they're going to be here after we're gone. So you might let them do it for you. And my parents, my dad was, you knew my dad. He was a rather reasonable guy. And that sounded okay to him. And again, because they trusted the leadership. In fact, one of the leaders of that group was the officiating pastor at my brother's wedding down in Galveston many years ago. They were that close to us, and they were a good bunch of people. And they taught me a reasonable faith and taught me to think a little bit before I left home, which was really good when I went to university.
So tell us about your Christian college experience and where did you deviate from the stuff that they were teaching you? Because I know that you did a lot of sociological stuff later on. Was there such a thing as a Christian social consciousness and social work, counseling? Were all those things available at that time, or they grew out later? And did you get to experience those?
They were starting at that time. In fact, my goal was to become a psychologist, which my father didn't object to at all. There were a few Christian psychologists on the writing circuit at the time, but they weren't as well known as, say, a James Dobson or somebody like that. My father knew, both my parents knew that I had a soft heart, and they knew that I would probably end up in a helping profession of some kind. So when my brothers were engineers, my dad's an engineer, my cousins are all engineers, some of them are all married to engineers. But my dad had no problem sending me to this Christian college where I went because they had a psychology program. And they also had a social work program, a BSW program. And even though it was a mainstream evangelical college, there were a lot of ideas that were foreign to me at that university. And the funny thing was, David, one of the people that my leader had asked me about, who was Lutheran and had a different eschatology, and she said, "Well, she's got a different eschatology. You got a problem with her?" She was a year ahead of me at that university, so that was kind of fun. That I had a couple people. I was 150 miles from my hometown, but I had a couple people from that community there who were not of the same stripe of Christianity. And I will say they had quite a variety of Christians. They also had some non-Christians there. And because I was kind of a different kind of guy, I seemed to attract a different kind of people, uh, people who were a little different in their thinking from what I grew up with. And I hung around with Catholics and Episcopalians, some non-religious people. There was one Muslim there for a while. I don't know how he wound up there. He was from Saudi Arabia, but he and I got to be friends. And it was a very mind-opening experience. One critical thing that happened, I was taking an Old Testament survey course in 1980, my first semester there. And we were talking about the um, theocratic government of Israel at the time under the Torah. And our professor was talking about it, and some guy raised his hand and mentioned Jerry Falwell, and said, "Well, Dr. Jerry Falwell is talking about how we can have a government like that for the United States." And my professor, who had lived in Israel, spoke fluent modern Hebrew, was just the nicest guy in the world. He was a Southern Baptist, but he's the nicest guy in the world. All he said very quietly was, I wouldn't listen to Jerry Falwell if I were you." And I think that at the time kept me away from that nascent fundamentalist nationalism that started at the time, because a professor that I deeply respected and just thought the world of said, "Don't listen to Jerry Falwell." He was very nice about it, but he said,
So
"Don't
let's
listen."
let's educate people about Jerry. So what I know of Jerry, he's the kind of guy that would say what we would call now like a provocateur type
Yes,
of
yes,
thing to get people riled up. So I think there was a hurricane or something, and he said it was the gay community of that time that brought it about. So he had a very tit for tat biblical understanding. And although that is how it's described in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew scriptures, that when the children of Israel misbehave, there is plagues and there is repercussions for their actions. Uh, he was a literalist, and he saw the U.S. as some type of um, Israelite outpost or something like that. Um, now a lot of these things are coming to the surface. Like, um, what is that term they use for manifest destiny or some type of you know, the city upon a hill mentality
Yeah.
of the U.S. So
Right, that it has some kind of theological standing, and that somehow they find it mentioned in either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. And I have a dear friend who asked me recently. He says, "Well, where does the U.S. fit into prophecy?" And I said, "It doesn't. I'm sorry, it doesn't.
well,
We're not that special, you
so
know."
they use a couple of Bible verses where they say that the hedge of protection over the U.S. comes from a nation that calls God by their name will be blessed or something like that. Um, and then they, like you said, they weave some type of end of the world scenario where the U.S. is going to be involved in protecting Israel against the Russians or the Chinese to before the Antichrist takes over. But it's a lot of sophistry because, like you said, is the U.S. is not mentioned at all. There is nothing related to what's been happening now. Um, but slowly he started building these connections with political figures, and now we know that there's that family cult where
Yes,
they wanted to sign up all
very,
the presidents to their agenda, and
very
then
influential.
other kinds of groups were stirring the government in their direction.
Yeah. Let me circle back to 10 years earlier. Um, at that time, there was a belief among my branch of fundamentalism that America was not that special, and that in the end times, America would be destroyed and the whole world would weep, because that was their prophecy, that the whole world would weep when the United States was destroyed because it was such an economic powerhouse. That was what was preached when I was young. So that was part of our persecution complex as well. And that not we weren't persecuted because we were weird, we were God's special people, but we were going to potentially be destroyed in the end times, or murdered or tortured before Jesus came in the rapture to save those who were left. So, as a child, even though my pastors and the adults and my parents were very kind people, you know, that kind of scarred me, and that I was sure that I remember, I think it was 1973, New Year's Eve. I had read some kind of, like I said, I had a very advanced reading level. I read some kind of eschatology text before I went to bed on New Year's Eve, and I was sure that when the clock struck from 1972 to 1973, that the world would end. And I didn't sleep the whole night. I sat there the whole night waiting for the world to end, and I was sure the U.S. would be destroyed and the world would weep, and then the rest of the apocalypse would happen. So Falwell coming on the scene and saying, "Oh no, we're not going to be destroyed. We're going to be the new Israel." That was really exciting for those of us who felt inferior, although I didn't buy into it. The other thing during the 70s, due to that sort of inferiority complex, if there was the tiniest hint of an athlete or a celebrity or a politician being a Christian, we'd latch onto that. Bob Dylan had his born again period. All of a sudden, we were okay because Bob Dylan was one of us. Or in the early '80s when the band U2 came on the scene, and three of the four members claimed to be Christians. Oh, we'd latch onto them because now we're a little more legitimate because a rock band. It was silly stuff like that that was part of that era. So you can kind of see when Falwell comes on the scene in 1980 and says, "Hey, we're special, we're good, we don't have to cower in fear, we're God's chosen people." That a lot of people jumped onto that, and the current Christian nationalism of our day has kind of built from that. In fact, there's some journalists and writers who call Falwell the godfather of Christian nationalism.
Did you get a chance to see that video with your boy with Tucker
Doug Wilson?
Carlson? Yeah.
No, I didn't. I didn't see it. I was at work when you sent it to me. I didn't have time to look at it.
So in the last 15 minutes, we're gonna speed up to. Uh, you've mentioned in the previous shows when you broke off from the the evangelical movement because there was a lot of um, hoopla and trying to entertain the parishioners and trying to make it exciting or something like that, and you bounce back to more traditional Christianity. But what is coming to the surface, uh, piggybacking on our previous conversation, is that the Christian community is very disjointed and very like aimless, and just like the conservative movement, any clown or someone who has a little bit of charisma or a little bit of almost like verbal manipulative tactics can take it over very quick, because there's no again, we only see what the media wants to show us or what
Right.
becomes popular on YouTube or things like that. So we're victims of almost like yellow journalism, sensationalism on all fronts. But Doug Wilson uh, came across as very uninformed, just like Mike Huckabee in their interviews with Tucker. And Tucker is almost like a Hillary Clinton type of character where they can take over any conversation and twist it for their own agenda. The reason I'm beating up on Hillary Clinton is because Hillary and what's her name? The African American lady that worked for Bush, um, Condi
Oh,
Rice.
Condoleezza Rice. Yeah, Condoleezza Rice.
They were both interviewed by Jon Stewart when he had the show on Apple, and it was hilarious how easily they were able to gear the conversation towards a neocon perspective. And he was trying as hard as possible to challenge them, but he was also scared to upset them because he's a big Democratic supporter. That he couldn't get anything through as Hillary pretty much took over and made it her show. That's what Tucker Carlson did with both Huckabee and Wilson, and it was all about um, misinforming and challenging the public about the legitimacy of the state of Israel. When we all have issues with what's going on, we all feel that there's a lot of injustices happening during the current regime there, but um, being a preacher or being fundamentalist politician does not give you the ability to be able to debate, to be able to respond clearly to uh, people like Carlson, who is a provocateur. Um, so you end up in this kind of like messed up situation where you get ridiculed very easily, um, because the only people that you ever talk to are the choir in your own church. So the moment that you get thrown out of the dogs to the modern gotcha so-called reporters, you have nothing to stand on. So it's he's as good or even more manipulative as like Bill Maher, where at
Hmm.
the end they are speechless. Like he comes out of left field with all kinds of stuff, and they don't have the data, they haven't been coached, they haven't thought through it. It's almost like they're so arrogant they think they can take on a guy like him.
As a traditional Christian, and I consider this different from um, a conservative evangelical or a fundamentalist. I don't have to convince anybody of anything. In fact, we're called to be humble. We're called to be quietly kind to other people. If I was interviewed by anyone, if I were to be interviewed by anyone, and they would ask me what I would know about certain things, I would have to plead ignorance a lot. Uh, I would speak from my convictions, but the only thing I was ever considered an expert on, and that was for about maybe not even 5 whole minutes, is I wrote a dissertation on influences of NAFTA on Mexican engineering education. And honestly, that dissertation was obsolete by the time I defended it. So I was an expert on that very, very, very narrow thing for a very brief time. So when people ask me questions, I try to consider humbly and honestly what to say. And if I have nothing to say, I'm going to say it. And if they ask me about my faith and they're truly interested, I'll tell them what I believe and what I think and how I act in accordance with that. And I think that kind of summarizes the next 30 years of my life after I went to college. Given a pretty broad education, not all that rigorous, but broad. I went to Ball State and got a master's degree and worked there for a while, and that was nice to work in a secular environment for a couple of years. Went to seminary. My seminary was, again, not horribly rigorous, but it was a broad education, and there was a lot of um, let's not fool around with stupid cultural stuff. Yeah, if you want to go see a film or something, that's fine. But let's try not to join in with the neocons and all these other people. And this was an evangelical seminary. There was no political stance at the seminary. In fact, it had been an Anabaptist seminary, and there was almost a quiet, we're not political, we don't do politics. You can, but we don't. And we had maybe 50 Protestant denominations in the master's program, and about the same plus Catholics, Orthodox, um, Coptic in the doctoral program. So you got to meet a lot of really good people. We even had this Amish guy that would ride his buggy into town and sit in on classes. He never enrolled, but he'd sit in on classes. So it provided a way of opening my mind a little more. Of course, then I moved to Mexico for 2 years, and I hate to say it because I had learned Spanish. I had hung around with Mexican and Hispanic people here, but I was blown away by culture shock. But as hard as those 2 years were, I consider them very formative because it gave me an outside view of American Christian culture. Mexican evangelicalism has their issues. In fact, some of the pastors I worked with had very astute critiques of Mexican evangelicalism. And that was helpful to me as they would critique their culture to make me think about mine. Um, got real sick, moved back to Ohio, was there a couple of years, moved to Arizona, worked in a church, enrolled in a PhD program. Tucson's basically a tricultural city, even though we have people from everywhere. It's mainly native, Hispanic or Mexican, and white people, although there are people from all over the world here. And I found myself very happy here because I had missed the cultural experience of being in Mexico City. Um, I think the real break from what I consider cultural fundamentalism probably came during the first Trump administration. Um, I had honestly been taken in by some of the conservative pundits and some of the uh, more Republican, Christo Republicans. Uh, and During COVID and during that first Trump administration, something turned in me. And I just realized it wasn't my role to get involved in political things, especially as a priest. My role is to pray for whoever is in power, whether that's Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and he certainly needs our prayers, or whoever's next, Hillary Clinton or Gavin Newsom or whoever. It's my role to pray for them and to live in peace with everyone and to love the Lord my God with all my heart, mind, and soul, and my neighbor as myself, um, plus the moral commandments of the Jewish moral law and the Christian moral obligation. So while I have no problem with people voting for whomever they want to vote for, um, that's no longer an emphasis in my life at all. I really stay clear of that stuff. I feel my role is now as a hospice chaplain and Anglican priest to inform people in my parish, to inform people of the Christian faith to the point where they can think for themselves and decide for themselves, which I did with my own children. And neither of them are religious at this point in their lives. Um, my role is to educate and enlighten people within the Christian faith as a priest. As a chaplain, it's to show kindness and the love of God uh, to whomever God sets before me to serve, whatever their background is.
Have you ever visited the Holy Land?
By accident, I was on a flight from Rome to Bombay, India, Mumbai, it's called now, and apparently there were some Israeli diplomats that had requested Alitalia to stop in Tel Aviv and pick them up. It would have been a flight all the way from Rome direct to Mumbai. We stopped in Tel Aviv, and because these diplomats were getting on our plane, it was a 747. It's kind of a funny story. I was sound asleep, and I wake up. There's this kid pointing an Uzi at the ceiling. He's in an IDF uniform, and he's shaking my shoulder. And there's no one else on the plane. He was sent in to make sure there wasn't nobody else on the plane. I was the only one on the plane. And in very, thickly accented English, he said, "You have to get up. You have to get up. That we're doing a security check on the plane." I said, "Where am I?" He says, "You're in Israel. You're in Tel Aviv. Come on, you have to get off the plane." And I get off the plane, and the security, IDF security person, checked my bag, and then I was ushered into another IDF security booth, and this woman's chewing bubble gum and blowing bubbles, and she says, "So, where are you from?" I said, "Ohio." "So, anybody put anything in your bag that you don't know about?" And I said, "Excuse me, are you from Brooklyn?" She says, "Yeah, I am. What of it?" So I had 2 hours in the Tel Aviv and Ben Gurion airport. That's my extent of visit to the Holy Land.
So the reason I ask is because Tucker has been pushing this propaganda that there is more Christians in Qatar than there are in the state of Israel. In the video that I sent you, they said that it was like 1.9% Christians, which sounds ludicrous, since 20% of the population are Arab. And then there's tons of Christian churches, Greek churches, Roman churches, Ethiopian churches. Like the place is packed with people from all over the world. A lot of Palestinians are actually not even from the Middle East. They're like Greek and Armenian. Um,
Yeah.
a third of, a fourth of, it's more like two fourths of Old Jerusalem is Christian. Uh, so to make up a number and say that the immigrants that are building Qatar in the sand, who some of them are Christian, is a greater number than the Christians in the state of Israel is ridiculous. And he keeps pushing that. And unless you've been there and are you counting or paying attention, it fits the narrative to paint. And they've been doing this for a long time to try to paint Israel as some type of Jewish theocracy, even though only 10% of the population is religious, and that they're the most racist and discriminatory towards other religious groups. So I, I don't know what the relationship of the Church of England is with the state of Israel, but I um, I heard something that the Queen of England doesn't like them or something. Um,
Well, yeah, the Church of England is about to implode, and it really has very little standing anymore. Um, I think my views on the state of Israel do come both from my fundamentalist upbringing and from, my friend who was Jewish growing up. My mom and dad loved him, and they always said, respect his faith, be nice to him, be his friend. They loved him. And I grew up hanging around his house all the time, and he grew up hanging around my house all the time. We're still in touch. Um, and I have, spoken with folks, Jewish folks who have been to Israel, and they tell me the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I've always known that there was a historic Christian population in Israel, not just the neocon people that have started what they call the International Christian Embassy there. Most of those historic Christians there are not evangelicals. Some are Anglican, some are Catholic, Orthodox, Coptic, Armenian, the whole. the whole gamut. And the state of Israel has been more tolerant of permitting Christians to live and flourish than their neighbors have. And like you said, in Qatar, at any given time, there may be temporary immigrant labor force of primarily Filipino Christians working there. But their goal isn't to settle there and live as Christians. Their goal is to, make money and send it home, and when they're done, go home. So it's not the same.
Tom, are you available for another 30, 40 minutes so we can turn this into two shows?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay. So,
where would you like to go from here, though?
well, I don't want to church change you on your testimonial about growing up evangelical. I want to go deeper into the things that bother you. I remember calling you or talking to you around the Trump first election and pretty much telling me that you got bullied into voting for him because your family's so conservative and they made a good case that he would give a place on the table for evangelical needs and wants. But now that we've seen what he has done with that opportunity, and after the way he treated Mike Pence, I would like to hear the most egregious things that you found problematic against your beliefs. But you dropping the bomb that the Church of England is about to implode, does that have to do with President Andrew? Does it have to do with some of the cultural stuff that is going on? That's a huge thing to share at the end of one show, so I would like to flesh that out.
Well, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, the first among equals, was a legit. Now, it changed the laws, the canon law of the Church of England. They changed the canon some time ago so that women could be ordained to the priesthood, and then again changed the canon so that women could be consecrated as bishops. Uh, so if, if I'm in a splinter group, an Anglican splinter group that is not subject to uh, the Church of England. In fact, most Anglican jurisdictions outside of England, with few exceptions, are not subject to to their jurisdictional authority. The reason I say that is I have nothing against Sarah Malali personally. I don't know much about her. She was, I think, the head of nursing for the English National Health Service. She's obviously a very accomplished person. However, um, not too long ago, I found out that her theological education had been kind of the equivalent to going to night school. And again, if you're going to be a parish priest, there's nothing wrong with that. However, if you're going to be uh, the priest in a decent sized church, if you're going to become the Bishop of London and then the Archbishop of Canterbury, um, there's a lot of qualified people, women included, who have master's and PhD degrees from Oxford and Cambridge and Durham and Glasgow and some of these other universities of great theological rigor. And now, maybe they elected her for her administrative capabilities, but I know I found out recently that there's quite a few people in the Anglican hierarchy that you know paid their dues. They became priests when they were 25, uh, studied theology, learned the biblical languages, became theologians, and were passed over because they feel that Sarah Malali was, um, I hate to use this term anymore, a DEI hire. The reason I hate to use that is it's overused. And I mean, I know there are unqualified people who get hired, but I want to be careful using that. That is one of the terms that was used. And there's a former Anglican priest. He was the chaplain to the Queen while she was still alive, named G.K. Ashenden, and he converted to Catholicism. And he has a lot of commentaries on these sort of things. And being that he still has inside knowledge of the Church of England because of his long career there. He's not a priest in the Catholic Church. He opted for different reasons not to pursue the priesthood in the Catholic Church, but he knows where everything is in the Anglican Church, and it sounds like, for one, there's a lot of upset people. Two, there's a lot of contention in the church. The church was becoming very progressive, and then somebody just slammed the brakes on as far as same-sex marriages, same-sex blessings, all that stuff. And whether you agree with that or not, slamming the brakes on a movement like that is going to cause some issues. The other thing is your average Sunday attendance, and I don't have the stats in front of me, but your average Sunday attendance is a fraction of what it was even 10 years ago. They're taking Anglican parish churches in the countryside that nobody attends and turning them into government community centers because nobody went to church anymore. So they just turn them into a community center instead of a church. So you can get your mail there, you can vote there, you can have a reception there. And that's not just the Anglican Church, that's many, many churches in the Anglosphere, as we call it. So I don't, also, the Anglicans of Africa and South America, in great majority, have severed their ties with the Church of England, their fellowship ties, over Sarah Malali's elevation to the archbishop. And there was one African bishop, I believe he was in Kenya. He said, "We're going to have the see, or the headquarters of world Anglicanism, rotate between conservative Anglican jurisdiction." He said, one year for 6 years the archbishop will be the bishop of Lagos in Nigeria. Another 6 years it'll be the bishop of Nairobi. Another 6 years it'll be the bishop of Zambia, or Chile, because they no longer look to England as the leader of the Anglican Church anymore. So basically what they're saying is England's gone off on its own, and we are Anglican by heritage, even though we're not English, and we're going to carry forward the Anglican tradition and message ourselves because the Church of England isn't doing it. And any growth in Anglicanism has taken place basically below the equator in recent decades.
Can I tell you the parallel thing that happened in the Catholic Church and somehow the Catholic Church came clean from it?
Yeah, please.
So my friend was had left the priesthood, but he was keeping up with what's going on, and he was very upset about Pope Francis being so progressive that when he heard that Pope Francis was toying with the idea of embracing um, gay couples and blessing them, he said that Bishop Joseph Strickland from Texas was going to splinter off the real Catholic Church, which was all the traditionalists, including the African churches. And that the African churches would not put up with any deviation from the faith. And what was incredible is that I started listening to Catholic radio, and they were saying the same thing. They were saying that they would never break moral law. They would never go against nature. They would never go against biblical mandates for morality and stuff like that. And then Francis did a power move, and he said, "Oh, I don't want to support gays. I want to support trans." And suddenly, 1 week later, the same radio hosts were saying, "God bless, Pope Francis. He spoke on behalf of God. We're gonna support him 100% in everything he does and says," because they didn't want to get fired, because Strickland was ousted as being unfaithful. And then I know, I have a lot of theories, but this theory I believe is true. The African churches had nothing to stand on because they receive a lot of money from the European Roman churches, and they contribute very little. So they had to get in line too, or they would be left out in the cold. So everyone lined up behind the Pope very quickly, and all these inner fighting and all that all went away in a second because he took it as far as he could, and then there was no more reason to debate or fight about it.
I wonder if the Church of England does. I kind of assume the Church of England no longer has the funds to bribe foreign jurisdictions into being with them. That's just speculation. I can't say that they don't, but if they're losing closing parishes in England, I wonder if they just don't have the money to influence uh, foreign jurisdictions like they used to. Don't know. And again, some people will argue that outside of England and Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, that Anglicanism is just part of the colonial past. Um, I do think in Africa, especially, they have modified Anglican faith to the point where it is more indigenous than English, even though they follow the same liturgy. They are very conservative theologically, but there's an Anglican church in Stafford that's primarily Nigerian, and I keep wanting to go there when I'm in Texas, but I just never. It's on Murphy Road. I never seem to be able to work it so I can go. My niece wanted to go with me. One of these days I'll go there. I want to see what their worship is like compared to ours.
Well, going back to the evangelical movement, um, can you just like cut through all the mess and give us the straight answer? Is it all a scam? Is it all money laundry for the Republicans? Because if we're talking about money, I believe the reason that the Pope went so woke is because he wanted the money from the French and the Germans, which they tax the populace to um, to get a tithing that is already institutionalized, and they wouldn't give it to the Catholic Church if the Catholic Church would discriminate against any people. So to get those funds, he had to make them happy. Um, is the same way with Trump and all those guys? Like they just want to have their tax write-offs. They want to be able to build their giant churches. They want to play the victim so then they can push their agenda. But at the end, it's just a money bending, money making enterprise, like we were talking about during one of our last shows.
I, I would I would be speaking out of ignorance. However, I will say this: when I went to seminary, some of the guys, and there were women there too. Some of I got to say, most of the women were pretty serious people. So I'm going to say most of the guys, and just about all the women, were very sincere and serious about entering ministry for the right reasons. Um, there were a few. I don't know if you're familiar with the novel Elmer Gantry. Uh, it's a novel from the early 1900s about a fraud minister. There were some Elmer Gantrys in seminary with me. I knew they were frauds, but for the most part, they were sincere people who really wanted to go out and serve congregations. And I remember one woman who was a nurse and made a good salary, and she was willing to sell everything. She and her husband, who was a Methodist minister, were willing to sell everything and move to the Navajo reservation to serve out in the middle of freaking nowhere. And he was making a decent salary as a Methodist minister. She was making a good salary as a nurse, and they were ready to go do that. So those were the caliber of people that I worked with. Um, I left seminary and went to Mexico. I made $300 a month, which in rural Mexico would have been a fortune. In Mexico City, I barely made it. And I had the same earnest desire to go out and serve people and serve God. What I found, and this is heartbreaking, what I found even in that small organization, and we get enculturated by our organizational cultures too. Uh, a lot of my PhD research had to do with organizational culture. What I found was they wanted everything to look good. Um, Publicity was really important. One of the words that just made me want to vomit was, well, the publicity's already been sent to the print. You know, uh, this is very hard to say, but I realized they may have been really sincere and believing people, but the perpetuation of the organization became more important than the mission of the organization. And I remember the guy who was the head of everything had this big picture of himself with Ronald Reagan on his wall. And that was his pride and joy that he had a picture of him with Ronald Reagan in some office in Washington. And that doesn't necessarily say he was just a grifter, but they were more concerned about how the program looked than the people who were serving in the program. And I felt like there was a disdain for my Mexican colleagues, and that really bothered me because I went down there with an open mind, and they said, "You're going to be working beside Mexican clergy." And this was before I was an Anglican. This was a different group. I'm not going to name the group. And you're going to go down there and work with these clergy, and because you're just out of seminary, you will be their link to us. Well, they liked that idea because that's where they got their money. I mean, the Mexican clergy, that's where they got their money. And some of the Mexican clergy were grifters and scoundrels. Some wanted money, but they realized I was a sincere human being and respected me for that. But I came home very disillusioned because while it wasn't about making millions of dollars, it was about perpetuating an organization so certain people could have an income. And that wasn't what I went down there for. That was that was a very hard lesson. And the fact that they didn't treat my colleagues down there as equals, even if they were grifters, uh, plenty of American grifters, so they could have treated them as equals, and that really bothered me too.
So where I started getting disillusioned with evangelical Christianity was when they were marketing and packaging it as a thing. So, there's the four spiritual laws, there's the little pamphlets, tracts that they give. There's weird analogies like, somebody gives you a gold coin, but you have to really want it, and that means accepting Jesus. Or here's a nail, and you got to stick it into the cross. Like when it starts becoming like a car salesman pitch, that's when it shows how shallow evangelical perspective is. And of
Yes,
course, you can go deeper, you can read the books, you can study all the treatises and all the teachings from different sermons and preachers and stuff like that. But early on, what was the name of that guy who said that sinners are like a spider that is on top of the fire?
Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah, so the Puritans had these like very like snappy ways to get people right with God. Um, I was just talking to a friend about how an illuminated manuscript is a Bible that is teaching ignorant people who are um, uneducated and they don't know how to read um, eternal truths through images. So the images had to be as um, filled with uh, ornaments and um, like symbols and stuff like that to be able to convey a specific message. So you always had the issue of communicating biblical or spiritual truths to people. Then, with I guess with the advance in culture, that's why we're talking about the T-shirts and posters and video games and cartoons and stuff like that, where you're trying to make something deep uh, easy to swallow and bite-sized chunks, and then it becomes a product. Was that, as you mentioned before, trying to entertain, trying to excite people about Christianity? Was that what um, got you away from it? And then the political component of, um, if we're not in cahoots with the powerful, then we're not really representing Christ in the world.
There was a point where any political thought was pretty separate from uh, somewhat compartmentalized from religious thought. However, the last big evangelical church I worked in was about 300 people, and I remember going to staff meetings, and every staff meeting was like, okay, what can we do this week that's going to, kind of uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Be more exciting than last week. And I began to think this is just a circus. And it was a show, and it was, let's get people revved up, let's get people. Now, we didn't get as ridiculous as some churches. I mean, the pastor never rode a wheelie down the main aisle onto the altar, like some churches. But it got to the point where, I mean, I was still pretty serious. My role in that church, as they told me, was to link the poorest parts of Tucson with the suburb the church was in. And I was bringing Mexican pastors up and translating for them during services. I was bringing drug addicts to church that were trying to get clean. One Sunday, I brought a stripper to church that wanted to come to church, and that might have been when they decided to fire me. I don't know. Um, my role, and my goal was to uh, both in an evangelistic way, but also in a charitable and socially conscious way, reach out to some of the people who were in the worst straits in Tucson and bring them to church, help them out, get them involved in the community, get them hooked up with community services. Because I had worked in mental health, I knew most of the community services in the Tucson metro area. Um, People would come to church, and I'd hook them up with the help they could get, either financially or food boxes or psychiatric care. Um, and I realized nobody cared about that. They cared about whatever the show was going to be next Sunday. And the church eventually let me go, which was a good thing. It hurt my feelings at the time. I felt like I had more than accomplished what they had called me to do. I went to work at a agency that contracted with the drug court program. I did that for a while. Then I worked for a Christian drug and alcohol support ministry, and they were um, kind of hyper charismatic Christians. I had worked out a program between the county office of probation with them, so that probationers could attend their program without getting in trouble with the court. And shortly after that, they called me in and let me go. And I had no idea why. Again, that was a pretty big letdown. So my dismissal from the missionary organization, which I kind of, that wasn't a dismissal, that was sort of an agreed upon separation. My dismissal from the church, and then from this charismatic support program for drug addicts, very much disillusioned me about what are these people really about? Are they about loving God and loving their neighbors? And fell backwards into a hospice chaplain job. They only hired me because I could speak Spanish. That was the only reason they hired me. I had applied with them before, and I didn't have CPE and the requisite chaplain training. But about a year later, after I had originally applied with them, I was told by a friend who was on the inside of the organization that they were desperate for a Spanish-speaking chaplain that had the requisite um, educational credentials. And he knew I did, and he took my resume to the owners, and I've been there for 21 years now. Honestly, I feel like the chaplain role at this hospice has allowed me to live my ideals as a Christian better than most churches I've worked in.
And to finalize, it was hard to detach from the conservative movement when they were claiming that somehow Trump could be an advocate for conservative causes. It was compelling, just like now it is compelling for me, that even though he's a racist, a pig, um, sexist, warmonger, a kidnapper, um, pedophile protector, uh, sleazy and mobster, and destroying the economy and the tariffs and stuff like that, because he has some type of interest in the well-being of Jews, even though a lot of it is, bought and paid for and politically, dealing with his funders or his family members or whatever. And he comes across as moderate compared to the Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson's out there. Um, we're all interested in our own interests. We all want for our people to be protected, for our people to have a sense of ability to thrive. So I can see how Christians felt that compared to Biden, compared to Obama, Trump or Hillary, Trump would give a little bit of protection, support, and access to your people. What is different now from the original idea that a Trump presidency could be beneficial to all Christians?
The thing that pulled the plug for me, there were a lot of things that bothered me, but when he named Paula White Cain as his director of the religious office in the White House, um, Paula White Cain to me represents the worst of modern neocon Christianity. Um, I don't believe she teaches true Christianity. I believe she's an opportunist. Um, it's kind of like the Sarah Mullally thing in England. Of all the people, the thoughtful, educated, Irenic, and kind people that he could have named to that office, he named Paula White Cain, who's completely, in my mind, not qualified as a religious leader. Um, that was the main time the rug got pulled out from under me. And following that, seeing some of the people that um, were going to Washington and genuflecting in front of Paula White Cain and Donald Trump, it just made me sick. And I pray for the president. I want good for the country. I'm not one of those people that loses sleep at night over him, but uh, that was the initial breaking point. And then during the pandemic, I was home a lot and I didn't have a whole lot to do. Only certain facilities would let me visit patients. So I did a lot of research on alternative points of view and found that some of them were pretty reasonable. Um, I don't have to agree with someone completely to find that they have a good point about something. And some of the left wing commentators that I don't agree with mostly, but they brought up some logical points about the president's actions and things, and there were some reasonable right wing people saying the same thing. But to be totally honest, the fact that he would use a uh, a religious grifter and con artist like Paula White Cain for his influence, man, that pulled the rug out for me. And again, I don't hate him. I don't hate any of these people. I pray for them. I hope they change and act for the better. And that's one of the Anglican prayers that we do quite commonly every Sunday. We pray for our political leaders. It doesn't matter Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, we pray for them, and we can disagree firmly with them. I'm sure that there are Anglicans in Pakistan who pray for their government because we're called to do that, and they don't agree with the Islamic government of Pakistan, but they pray for them. And couple, well, some years ago, I decided that there were two things, and I know you're going to think the first one's funny, but I always thought Mexican people were more polite than American people. I felt like in public settings, most Mexican people always spoke respectfully and were more culturally respectful to each other, at least the lower class people. And that always influenced me. And I thought, I am going to make an effort to speak more respectfully to all the Americans I deal with. The other one was I can't help but treat hospice patients with a great deal of care because they're vulnerable and they're dying. And then I realized one day everybody's vulnerable and dying. And I'm going to treat everybody like a hospice patient because I think that's loving your neighbor as yourself. And as a Christian, you make the sign of the cross. It's the love of God vertically from God to man, and side by side, it's the love of God through us to those around us. And there's certain political uh, platforms and beliefs and practices that don't fit that. And if they don't fit that, I'm just not going to participate anymore.
But on the other side, if we don't participate, then we are allowing for things to deteriorate even worse. And so the original premise of Christian conservatism was if the US goes a different route, and this is where that's why I could have a conversation with the white nationalist guy, and even there's a reporter guy who's conservative, and they're pulling the Sam Harris nonsense of the barbarians at the gates, which really makes me angry because that's what Hitler was saying about the Jews. um, so this idea that if we let the atheists or the radical Muslims take over, then we're going to turn into something that is irrecognizable for us Americans, which is two distinct perspectives that are either too progressive or too restrictive, and that the happy medium is this Christianese, somehow European style democracy, or they call it a representative republic, um, where Jews can thrive, where Muslims can worship, where atheists can do their thing, but there's a sense of the majority gets to decide what's best for everyone without having a totalitarian rule like what the real Christian nationalists want to do. Um, so if you allow for these foreign or out there perspectives to take over, then you don't know what to expect. And I think Jews, since the Holocaust, have been able to navigate Christianity way better than the way they've been able to navigate Islam when it used to be the other way around. Um, so that's why Jews are becoming more conservative. That's why Jews are more aligning with the traditionalists. Even like it makes me mad because they're actually hanging out with neo Nazis and other folks who hate them, but have conservative values or family oriented perspectives or whatever. So, um, what if we stand away from politics? What if we become like the Judeo-Christians of Rome, where they said, we have nothing to do with what Nero is doing. We're gonna do our own thing, and then Nero turns against them and starts burning them and setting them on fire. And I call them Judeo-Christians because I don't believe that they were um, all Gentile and all Byzantine by that time. I think they were very Judaic, and
They were.
the Jews were protected by the Roman Empire, but somehow because they were distinctive, either as followers of Jesus or as a threat to the empire, he decided to come after them. Um, so wouldn't it make sense for Christians to run for office, for Christians to vote, for Christians to look for candidates that believe in their values? Because if not, then you're going to end up in a situation where they're going to devalue the things that matter to us. And although I don't fully agree with the Texas governor forcing the Ten Commandments in every room and getting rid of non-Christian clubs and trying to pass. There was a couple of things that he was doing. Oh, trying to put in chaplains instead of unqualified chaplains instead of counselors. Um, I do believe that if you don't even bring up that some of the rules in the U.S. are based on the Ten Commandments, that spiritual issues do affect children and everyone. So maybe a chaplain and a counselor, not just a chaplain, especially a preacher chaplain. And then that kids are being exposed to too many political and um, morally dubious things too early on. Um, so the backlash is really the problem, and it's making us all look bad. But there are some points that I don't fully disagree. Oh, the third one was to teach the Bible in school like as a historical document. Um,
Mhm.
I think they should teach it as literature. Um, so again, you have Christians overcompensating for what they saw as persecution. But if we as Judeo-Christians just stand back and say, well, this is disgusting, I don't want anything to do with it, then what is going to be the alternative? Either the extremists or the anti Judeo-Christians. So then you end up in a worse place.
I should clarify that when I said not participate, I didn't mean the whole political process. I meant, for me, the neocon Evangelical Alliance. I do believe that Christians should vote, should participate as they feel able and led in politics, whether it's to run for office or to participate in party organizations. I think that's totally fine. For me now, though, I will, and I don't, I want to clarify this too. I don't believe the U.S. Constitution is a divinely inspired document. I do believe it's pretty good. And when I vote, I will vote primarily on what I think are the best candidates that will protect constitutional freedoms. And that is derived from my opposition to Christian nationalism, in the sense that I want to be free to express my faith how I feel free to do it, as long as it's, legitimate, not harming anyone else. And I want you, David, to be able to express your faith with total freedom. So when I vote now, it will be more under the auspices of constitutional freedoms, especially First Amendment freedoms, um, for everybody. Um, and I do think there are some good people. There's a pretty decent guy here in Tucson that ran for Congress and didn't make it. He seems like a good Christian man, has a great testimony, seems like a nice guy. Um, Probably doesn't help that he could be Saddam Hussein's twin, but he ran for office as a conservative Republican. I think he's a good guy. I almost had a chance to meet him yesterday. He was doing something downtown, and I talked to one of his buddies that was there, and he wandered off. But I have no problem with him as a conservative evangelical running for Congress or whatever office he chooses to. So I agree. We don't want to just bow out and let evil take its course. But my focus will not be partisan anymore. It will be more constitutional freedoms, and again, especially First Amendment freedoms. Not that the other guaranteed freedoms and rights in the Constitution aren't important, but that's what I'm focused on right now: is freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, those sort of things.
Okay, and last 5 minutes. So I just booked a conversation with Nick Matau. I don't know if you ever seen him online. He's ex-Catholic, white kid with a beard, and he keeps representing the state of Israel, like his biggest supporter. A lot of people might say that he is getting paid or that now he has a booker or something like that that I was just talking to. So, what questions would you ask a conservative young person who, in one of the interviews, he said, I believe that anybody who disrespects the U.S. needs to be deported, which to me that's a pretty radical thing, and I actually want to bring up to him. But he also is the kind of guy that some of it is um, through quotes and statistics and stuff like that. He proves that a lot of the accusations against the state of Israel are illegitimate or exaggerations. And the other one is almost like what's good for Israel is good for America, or what's good for America is good for Israel. This type of again hyper love for Western ideas that if you have a modern state like the state of Israel in the Middle East, it's like a beacon of hope for a lot of challenging stuff that is going on in the Middle East. Um, in I guess what the progressives would say, why are you allowing a mostly ethno state that is democratic for the Jews, but whenever the Arabs want to have one, you always pull it over through the CIA or through some type of destructive means, like we talked in the last show. So, how would you counter this kind of blind allegiance to the neocon perspective? And I guess people who are educated would know that this is part of the new American century. The what was the one that they wanted to pass right before Trump got reelected? The it was like the 25 things. Um,
The 2025 plan or something like that.
yeah. Um,
Yeah.
how would you counter that perspective? Because all they're saying is we don't want the U.S. to collapse. We don't want Russia and China to take over. We want Israel to be safe. So why does everybody hate us?
Well, let me ask: does he claim to be a believer in Christ?
He said, "I grew up Catholic." That's all he said.
Okay. If he's not religious, I wouldn't bother with the religious part. If he is, I'd say, how does what's happening in Gaza comport with Christian faith? And how do you feel about the Christians in Gaza and in the West Bank? Um, I'm a supporter of the state of Israel. I am not a supporter of the current government of Israel, just like I'm not a supporter of the current government of the United States. If I lived in Israel, I would pray for the government and have that much allegiance to the government. But that would be my question about um, if you're a believer in Christ, how does this comport, what's going on there, comport with Christian faith? It doesn't. It doesn't even comport with Jewish faith. The current government is out of control, and you just can't do that to a group of people and can be considered a civilized group of people. Now, I'm not saying that about the whole state of Israel. I know there's a lot of Israelis that are not happy with the situation. If he's not a believer at all, I would say, well, um, how does this comport with international law? Is what the current uh, coalition government in Israel doing? Is it in accordance with international law? The other thing I would say is, if you're worried about the downfall of the United States, this is the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet. When you consider the natural resources and navigable rivers in the United States, we are filthy rich. If we're $40 trillion in debt, it's because we're stupid. We've got oil, we've got copper, we've got steel, we've got gold, we've got iron, we've got these rivers where you can float all this stuff down to New Orleans and ship it to the whole world. We are the envy of the world. We are filthy rich. Um, we don't share it among ourselves, and we're incredibly in debt. The only reason the United States might collapse is by our own government stupidity. And if you want to keep the United States from collapsing, just stop electing stupid people or narcissistic people or uh, psychopathic people. Um, it's not the communists right now, or the Russians, or the Chinese, or the Islamic Caliphate supporters. We're our own worst enemy. I'd ask them that. You really think we're going to collapse? We have everything. It's our own stupidity that will collapse from, not from somebody stealing it from us. If people steal it from us, it's because we're stupid, not because we weren't blessed. And I don't think that blessing is necessarily um, a divine right to exist as a country. I think the original colonists and the people who bought the Louisiana Purchase and the people who took the Southwest and Texas from Mexico, I don't think they had any idea of the wealth that was in those lands, California, until modern technology allowed us to see it. We're filthy rich. We have no reason to collapse except we've elected idiots to manage our well-being. That'd be what I'd tell them. Xenophobia isn't the problem; it's our own stupidity.
Well, we're gonna leave it at that. We want to thank you for your time. It's always intriguing and enlightening to have you share your wisdom, and all your experiences and spiritual practices have gotten you to where you're at. I really feel that the overall theme of our conversation is that spirituality, that it is surface level, can say all the right things, but when it comes down to moral issues or uh, ethical things that need to be addressed, then everybody runs for the hills and has nothing to stand on. And that to me is the one thing that bothered me the most about getting wrapped up in the conservative movement at a young age. I was very naive. I was very idealistic. I was very hopeful that somehow God was working through these very flawed people. And then you find out that the you can say that people were authentic, honest, or sincere, but they were very misguided and they were very um, like you said, the institution, the organization, and their own reputation was put before their commitment and conviction towards God and His principles, and that's is sad and sickening. And it's only their darn fault when now they complain that most of the youth wants nothing to do with their stuff, and it's like because they squandered it. There was a great
Yep.
opportunity to influence the culture for the better, and instead they made a mess out of it. So then it's all old folks that are trying to hold the fort, and maybe it might be a little too late for some of the population.
I think some of that perceived persecution complex inferiority that I talked about in the 70s made people want to latch onto strong leaders for their own protection. And you see where evangelicals have latched on to what appear to be strong leaders, but they're con artists and psychopaths. I'm sorry to say.
Man, you really bummed us out with that last statement.
There is hope, though. And the hope is in the common, everyday people that do the right thing every morning. And I love talking to people, talk to people at checkout counter, talk to people at DMV. And I tell them, there's good things if you look for them, and that everyday civility and camaraderie of life, uh, it makes me happy, and that's how I get up in the morning. Go talk to my patients and talk to the people around.
The last two
I love
minutes.
I love those people, and I love hanging out with them. And there might be a civil war in the future, but I'm waging a civility war every day by holding doors open and being kind. And we all can do that.
Hey, what the heck is going on in Mexico? I'm afraid to look into it.
Apparently, the government allowed, with some U.S. intelligence, to capture El Mencho, the uh, cartel de Nueva Generación de Jalisco, and he was killed. And the cartel, Nueva Generación de Jalisco, is retaliating by uh, taking over sections of Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta, and everybody's sheltering in place and just sort of waiting to see what happens. I don't think the U.S. military was part of the U.S. intelligence, no doubt was.
Okay, don't forget to blame it on the Jews. They're already
Well,
saying that it was the Israelis who did it.
isn't La Presidenta Scheinbaum, isn't she of Jewish heritage?
Yeah, but she's pro-Palestinian. She brought a bunch of refugees to Mexico, so uh, we can never
So
make
we
them happy,
can't blame her, huh?
Yeah. So, okay, well, again, blessings. Thank you for all your interest in keep supporting our show, and we'll be talking to you next time. Take care.
Thank you, David. It's always a privilege. Take care.